I want to ask you an honest question. Have you ever been in a store and it's been one of these stores where they have a sign somewhere that says simply, you break it, you bought it? You ever been in a store like that? Anybody? One person's been in a store, so congratulations, Kathy, for being the one person in the store. Well, I just want you to know I never have. I've never been in a store like that. My mom would never let me go in. She would never take me in to the store that says you break it. So I don't know. I'll have to talk to you afterwards, Kathy. You can tell me what it's like. Because even today, as an adult, my wife's like, I tell you what, why don't you stay in the car? It's probably best if you stay in the car, and I'll be out in just a minute, right? And I don't know what that's all about, but you break it, you bought it. We're wrapping up this series in the book of Ezra this morning, and at the beginning of the book, in chapter 1, what we saw was this group of Israelites returning after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, returning back to Judah. And when they got there, everything was ruined. They had to start over. They had to rebuild in the ruins. And now we're at the end of the book. We're wrapping the series up. We're in chapters 9 and 10 today. And as we get to the end of the book, Ezra is going to discover another ruined mess that's going to need to be rebuilt. And as we unpack these two chapters, and admittedly they're probably the two most difficult passages or chapters in the book, as we unpack them together, here's what I hope that you will remember. You don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin. But if you ruin it, rebuild it. You might want to write that down. We'll mention it throughout our sermon this morning. But if you walk away with something this morning, that's what I hope you remember. You don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin. But if you ruin it, rebuild it. So join me, if you would, in Ezra chapter 9. What we're going to see this morning, we jump back into the story. It's about 4 months after Ezra returned back to Jerusalem. So he's getting adjusted, he's getting settled in. And then some of the leaders come to him and say, Ezra, we got a problem, and we need you to deal with it. We need you to fix it. And the problem, I think, is summarized pretty well. I'm going to unpack all two chapters, hit the highlights, tell you the story. But I think the overall story of what the problem is and what needs fixed can be summarized in the first two verses of chapter 9. Would you join me there? When these things had been done, the Jewish leaders came to me, this is Ezra speaking, and they said this: many of the people of Israel, even some of the priests and Levites, those are the spiritual leaders of the community, even some of the spiritual leaders have not kept themselves separate from the other peoples, the other people groups living in the land. They have taken up the detestable practices of, and it gives a whole list of people groups that were into idol worship, that were into, some of them were even into human sacrifice. There were some pretty disgusting things that some of the people groups around them were into. And it says that this group of people had taken up these detestable practices of these people groups. And it says this in verse 2: for the men of Israel have married women from these people and have taken them as their wives for their sons. So the holy race has become polluted by these mixed marriages. Now, just hit pause real quick. We're not talking about something racist here. That's not what this is about. We'll unpack it. Be patient. Worse yet, the leaders and the officials have led the way. They've set the example in this outrage. So over 100 men, many of which were spiritual leaders in the community, they had married foreign women in violation of the law. This was clearly recorded in the law of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. You can check it out. Deuteronomy chapter 7, the first 4 verses address this. It's a law that they violated. And the law was this: there's this whole list of people groups around them, and they were not allowed to make treaties with these people groups. They were not allowed to marry people from these people groups. And most times when you have a law, like even in our system of laws, you don't normally get like the reason. Now it might be explained, the reason behind the law in some other context, but not very often does the law itself give the reason for why they wrote the law. But in this case, they did. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, they not only wrote, this is the law, don't do this, but they gave the reason why within the law. It says this, for they will, here's why the law exists, for they will turn your sons away from following me to other gods. So the reason was this guardrail. The law existed to be a guardrail so that they wouldn't wind up doing idol worship and all the other things that go with idol worship that are just inappropriate and terrible. And that's exactly what happened. If you look here in the beginning of verse 1, it says, they didn't keep themselves separate from other people. They have taken up the detestable practices of these people groups. So the whole reason why they had this law came true. They violated, and that's exactly what happened. Now, according to the prophet Malachi, not only did they violate the law of Moses, there were some of these men who actually divorced their Jewish wives so that they could marry these pagan women. And Ezra finds out about it, and it says here in chapter 9 that he was appalled, he was shocked, he was horrified, to the point where he describes his reaction as he tore his tunic, he tore his cloak, he ripped hair out of his beard and out of his head, threw himself down on the ground and wept. And before you start thinking or even whisper to your neighbor, wow, we need to get Ezra signed up for the drama club. I mean, hashtag overreaction. Before you start thinking like that, you need to understand why Ezra was so upset. And he tells us why he was upset. Starting in verse 6, he has this prayer, and he reveals why this is such a big deal. Because Ezra remembers why Jerusalem was destroyed in the first place. He remembers why his people were taken into captivity in the first place, because of their disobedience to God. And he thinks about the mercy of God, the grace of God. In God's mercy, He didn't wipe them off the planet. He kept a remnant of them alive in Babylon, and then gave them the opportunity to return 70 years later and rebuild. And he looks at the disobedience of the past, he looks at the grace of God, and he's like, I can't believe this. We're at it again. Ezra gave them 3 days to show up. And I understand that some of you might be looking at the story and you're like, okay, that seems like a big deal, but we're only talking about 110 guys. All right, I get it's a big deal, but it's like 110 guys out of tens of thousands. We really have to have a big meeting with everybody. But that's what they did. And he gave them 3 days to gather in the city of Jerusalem. And if they didn't show up, then they forfeited their property. And I guess the reason why he was treating this so aggressively is because so many of the 110 guys that are in this group of people that violated the law, a lot of them were spiritual leaders. And if the spiritual leaders are willing to violate the law, how long is it going to take for the rest of the people in the community to start compromising with sin? And so they dealt with this very seriously. And so Ezra gets them all together. They're at this one gate, this one courtyard area, and he confronts them with their sin. And one of the things that I think would make that even more uncomfortable, it says here in the story, not only were they dealing with something really uncomfortable and they're getting in trouble by their leader, but the weather was absolutely terrible. I just find that's fascinating, just the reality of not only are we getting in trouble, but it's this cold December rainstorm and we're standing outside and this is terrible and we don't want to be out here. And so they respond, you're right, we sin, we need to deal with this, but let's not do it right now out here in the rain. And so they agree on a plan. They agree that they're going to go back to their towns and they're going to get organized. They're going to come up with a plan to deal with this sin problem. And the plan was this, that those who had violated the law would divorce their foreign wives, and then those women and their children would return back. They would deport them back to their foreign people groups. And I'm sure that some of you right now are thinking, wow, that really seems extreme. I've got a lot of questions. Was there no other way to handle this? It might make some of you really uncomfortable. I think that's okay. It's okay that you feel uncomfortable. But you have to understand, this was a real ruined mess. And oftentimes with ruined messes, there's not a lot of easy solutions. That's just the way messes are. You know, when I was reading it and studying it, one of the modern day illustrations that came to mind is what's happening at our southern border. We've got children who are right now living in government facilities, and that happened because their parents tried to cross our southern border illegally, and they were separated from their parents. And now we've got the situation where some of those kids, we don't know where their parents are, and they're struggling to figure out what to do. It's a mess. And we got people that are saying, well, let's talk about who created the mess. It was the parents' fault. They should have never put their children at risk. They should have never tried to do something illegal. They're the ones who created the mess. And you got other people that are saying, no, it's the people who put these policies in place. That should have never happened. They created the mess. When we ask who created the mess, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'm going to let you figure that one out over lunch today when you go home. That should be a really fun lunch topic, right? I bring it up because I want you to understand that although this is an ancient story, I want you to understand that what we're dealing with is real people with real emotions, real families that are in a real mess, and there are no easy solutions to the problem. And that's the way life goes. When we've got a mess on our hands, figuring out how to fix it, figuring out how to rebuild is often a lot harder and a lot more complicated than we would like it to be. There aren't easy answers to some of these things. And maybe you don't like how Ezra handled the situation. But let's remember, first of all, that Ezra prayed about it. We know that he prayed about it. We know that the leaders surrounding him prayed about it. We know that the law was broken. We can demonstrate the law was broken. And we might feel bad, let's say, about a mom who is separated from her child because she's got to go to prison after breaking the law. We might feel bad for that woman. We might feel bad for that child, but she broke the law. And that's just a reality. On the other hand, when you look and study this, the law itself, there was no law that existed that demanded that they divorce and deport their wives. They didn't write that law because they already had a law in the book that says don't do this in the first place. So the only divorce law that we have in the ancient law, the law of Moses, was regulating divorce if something indecent was discovered. And even then, it wasn't demanded. Let's say there was something indecent discovered in a marriage. The law didn't demand that they divorce. It just regulated what that would look like if they chose to do so. And Jesus gave his insight on that particular law in the New Testament. Jesus, referencing, he was asked about that law, and he said this, that law was permitted, not demanded, it was permitted because your hearts are hard. Malachi, the prophet who recorded what these men had done, that they had divorced their Jewish wives so they could marry these foreign women, Malachi writes this, that God hates divorce. And he even gave the whole background story as to why it was happening. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament said that the believing spouse is to hang in there with the unbelieving spouse as long as possible. He said that in 1 Corinthians 7. So I bring all that up just to say there's not an easy answer to this. And that's how real life is. Figuring out how to fix something that's broken, figuring out how to rebuild something that's a ruined mess is so oftentimes a harder and more complicated thing than we would like. I also, just on a practical level, want to make sure you understand that what we are reading in chapters 9 and 10 is descriptive, not prescriptive. Now, those are doctrinal theology type words. I'm going to explain it to you and why it matters. They are descriptive, meaning it describes what happened. They're not prescriptive. They're not telling us what should happen. I'll give you an example, and I'll tell you why it matters. There is recorded for us in the Old Testament the story of David and Bathsheba. If you're not familiar with the story, simply, King David, he had an adulterous affair with another man's wife. It is a descriptive passage. It is not something you read and say, well, the king had an affair. That gives me the right to have an affair. It's not prescriptive. It's descriptive. An example of a prescriptive passage would be like the Old Testament laws, the Ten Commandments that say, one of the Ten Commandments is, do not commit adultery. That is a prescriptive passage. It tells us what to do, what not to do. Here's why that matters. You cannot take this, you should not take this story and say, you know, I'm reading through this, I should have never married the person that I married. And I read this and I'm like, oh, I'm pretty sure God's going to be okay if I bail on the marriage, if I divorce my spouse. No, that's not what this story, that's not the right way to apply this story to your life, because that's not how this story is written. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. So then how do we apply it? It's a tough story. And it makes us uncomfortable. How do we apply this difficult, descriptive passage to our lives? So I think one possible way that we can do that, something that we can learn from this passage, is that you don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin. You don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin, but if you ruin it, then rebuild it. Let's break those into two parts. Let's start with this idea of you don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin. You don't have to buy what you don't break. These men could have avoided this whole ruined mess if they had just obeyed God in the first place. And we know that to be true in our everyday lives, don't we? You can avoid the speeding ticket if you just go the speed limit. We can avoid the disappointment and the distrust that happens in a relationship because of a broken promise if we just keep our promise in the first place. You don't have to deal with the heartache and the heartbreak and the difficulty of trying to break an addiction if you never go down that road in the first place. We know this to be true. You don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin. And again, God's law is about not marrying a pagan woman. It wasn't a form of racism. That's not what it was about. It was a protective guardrail against compromising faith, against compromising obedience. And we see the wisdom because that's exactly what happened to them. Last week we looked at Ephesians 4:29 that says, don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, only the things that benefit others, only the things that would build other people up. It's better to keep your mouth shut. It's better to be very careful about what you say and how you say it than have to walk around apologizing to everyone for what you said and how you said it. You don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin. But let's just be honest with one another. We've got this tendency to ruin things, even when we know better. They knew better. They knew better. It wasn't like Ezra got them all out in the rainstorm, told them what they had done wrong, and they were like, "What? We are shocked. I wish someone would have told me that God wasn't okay with me divorcing my Jewish wife so I could run off with this exciting other woman. If only someone had told me before, I could have avoided this whole pickle." They knew better, and they did it anyway. And it's easy for us to criticize, but we do that too. There's so many times where we know better, and yet we still say the wrong thing, or maybe we do the wrong thing, we post the wrong thing. Maybe we make a bad decision, or we handle something without love, without grace. We break a promise, or maybe we break the law, and we make a mess, sometimes even when we know better. So then what do? Yeah, you don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin. We know that to be true, but we have this tendency to ruin things. So when we ruin it, rebuild it. I know we could probably go back and forth and maybe have a fun conversation over whether or not the divorce and deportation plan that Ezra and the leaders came up with, was that the best way to handle it? It'd be a fun conversation. But there are some things that I personally admire about the way Ezra and those leaders handled this situation. It's a hard one. It's complicated. They've got a mess to rebuild, and there's no easy answers to it. But there's some things I admire about the way they handled it. Number one, I admire these people for dealing with sin in a serious way, because that's not easy to do. These people were in the wrong. They knew it, and they humbly admitted it. They didn't make excuses for themselves. They didn't rationalize their sin. They didn't minimize their sin. They said, yeah, we're in the wrong. And they were asking the right questions. Like, okay, we're in the wrong. What do we do to fix this? How do we make this right? How do we rebuild what we ruined? They're asking the right questions. And I think it's easy to go through life and be like, my bad, sorry about that. That's easy. What's hard is change. What's hard is making things right sometimes. I had a friend, true story, I'm not going to give you any kind of time frame because I don't want you to try to sit there and figure out who he's talking about. You don't know him, okay? Let's just assume you don't know this person. I had a friend in the past and engaged to be married. And this guy and his fiancée, they had a conviction at some point that it was wrong that they were having sexual relations before marriage. It was wrong that they were living together. They had this conviction, and can you believe that they took this radical step where he moved out? And they chose to live with sexual purity until they got married, until the night of their wedding. That's pretty radical, some might say. In fact, some people would say, well, that sounds pretty extreme, that's pretty crazy. What I think is crazy is the fact, I admired them for what they did. What's to me crazy is they actually had some Christian friends that said, what are you doing? You're being kind of weird about this. You're getting married soon anyway. What's the big deal? That to me is kind of crazy that Christian people would give that kind of advice. Here's the problem with minimizing sin, the problem with rationalizing sin, the problem with ignoring sin. Sin never makes things better. It just doesn't. It always makes things worse. That's the nature of sin. You can try to rationalize it, you can try to minimize it, but sin will always ruin things. It's like cancer. Cancer has one function. The one function that cancer has is to destroy. That's all it does. There is no cancer that is programmed to make you healthier. I was thinking about the Apostle Paul in the Corinthian church, and the Corinthian church got this letter from the Apostle Paul about something that had been happening in their church. There was a guy in their church who was having sexual relations with his stepmom, and they weren't dealing with it. And Paul wrote them and said, you guys need to deal with this. It's not right. You know it's not right. And you need to deal with it. And if he won't repent, then you need to tell him he can't come back to church until he repents. And I can just imagine there were probably people in the Corinthian church that were like, whoa, that's super extreme. That makes me really uncomfortable. Paul's point, even in that letter, he said, guys, you need to understand the reason this needs to be taken seriously is because a little bit of yeast works its way through the whole batch of dough. I know what they did in chapters 9 and 10. It's hard, and maybe there was a different way to handle it. I don't know, but I admire them for dealing with it seriously. If I were to give you some homemade cookies. Now, first of all, if I gave you homemade cookies, you probably should ask who made these, right? I get that. That's fine. Because I don't bake. I'm not a good baker. But let's say that I am. Let's for the sake of the illustration, pretend I'm a good baker. And I give you a dozen, 2 dozen chocolate chip cookies, homemade, that I made for you. And I said to you, I just want you to know that when I made these chocolate chip cookies, I only used the freshest, the finest of ingredients. But I also want you to know that when I tore open the bag of chocolate chips, I ripped it open and they fell all over the place, including some into the litter box for Fluffy the cat. But you just need to know that I'm like 99% sure that I only picked up and used the clean chocolate chips, the ones that weren't contaminated in the litter box. I'm real confident about that. Most of you, I would think, would probably not say to me, you know what, that's fine. I'm okay with a little bit of cat poop in my chocolate chip cookies, as long as it's a little bit, you know. I admire them for dealing with serious things in a serious way. The other thing I admire about Ezra is the fact that he was willing to ask for help. Ultimately, Ezra is the one who had to decide how to handle this situation. It's difficult, but he asked for help. He didn't try to do it on his own. And maybe what's ruined in your life is complicated, and maybe it is difficult, and maybe it's embarrassing. But it's important that if you need help, you ask for help. It's okay to get counseling. It's okay to get an accountability partner. Let's say you've got a problem with pornography, and you're embarrassed about it. It's okay to ask for help, to get someone that you trust who could be your accountability partner, because that's a big deal. That can ruin your life. That could ruin your marriage. So if you need help, ask for help. Maybe you find yourself at some point in life where your marriage is struggling, and maybe you're embarrassed about that, and you don't want people to know your business or whatever, but that's a big deal. And if you need help, then ask for help. Get the counseling that you need. It's okay. Maybe you make a bad decision, and that bad decision has some bad results, and you make a big mess. Okay, maybe you're embarrassed, maybe you're ashamed of the mess that you've created, and you don't know where to start. It's like, I have no idea. This is a big mess. I don't know where to start. I don't know how I'm going to fix it. If you need help, then ask for help. In 2 Corinthians 12:10, the Apostle Paul wrote that he delighted in weaknesses. That's what he said. I delight in my weaknesses. I delight in insults and hardships and persecutions. I delight in difficulties. And then he said this, because when I'm weak, then I'm strong. What? When you're weak, then you're strong? What do you base that on, Paul? Well, he based it on what he said in verse 9. He says in verse 9, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. He saw his weaknesses as this opportunity to deepen his dependence on the power and the strength of Christ. So asking for help, relying on others, relying on Jesus, it's not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. One more thing that I admire in this story, in chapter 10, verse 2, I admire this guy named Shechaniah. It says in verse 2 of chapter 10 that Shechaniah says to Ezra, after Ezra is confronting people and they're trying to come up with how do we fix this, how do we deal with it, and Ezra, he's tearing hair out of his beard and his head. He's super upset about it. But Shechaniah says, we have been unfaithful to our God. We have married these pagan women of the land. We're guilty. We broke it. He says, but in spite of this, there is hope for Israel. I just admire the fact that Shechaniah had this hope in the forgiveness and the grace of God. He had hope that, yes, we broke it, yes, we ruined it, but it can be rebuilt because we have hope in the forgiveness and the grace and the mercy of God. Psalm 130, verses 3 and 4 says, if you, O Lord, kept a record of sin, who could stand? But with you there's forgiveness, therefore you are feared. 1 John 1:9 tells us if we confess our sin, that God is faithful, He's just, He will forgive us of our sins, and He will purify us from all unrighteousness. See, guys, this is the heart of the gospel, and what we believe about God, what we believe about Jesus, is this faith that we have in God's grace. We broke it, and we can't buy it. Our sin broke our relationship. Our sin broke our standing with God, and there is nothing that we could ever do to make up for that. That's why Jesus came. That's why He paid the price for what we broke, and He did it with His own blood on the cross. And when we trust Jesus to pay our sin debt that we can't pay on our own, Jesus promises to forgive us, to wash us clean, to give us a fresh start, to give us a new heart. He promises to make us right with God. I don't know what you've ruined. I don't know how badly you have ruined it. But with Jesus, there's hope. Because with Jesus, there's forgiveness. With Jesus, there is grace. He's the one who offers a new start. He's the one that tells us that God's mercies are new every morning. I don't know what you broke. And maybe you can't buy it. But it's important that we have hope that Jesus can. That Jesus can redeem those things that don't seem redeemable. That Jesus can rebuild those places that just seem ruined beyond repair. You don't have to rebuild what you don't ruin. That's true. But if you ruin it, then rebuild it. I'm going to close with just a couple questions. Probably the whole border immigration topic at lunch, bad idea. That'll probably ruin lunch, right? So here's some better questions that maybe you could discuss over lunch today. How about this? Is there something in your life that you need to change before you ruin it? Is there something in your life right now that you need to change before you ruin it? Maybe there's a conversation you need to have today with someone about that. How about this? Is there something in your life that's ruined? Maybe you ruined it. Maybe someone else contributed to it getting ruined. I don't know what it might be, but if there's something in your life that's ruined right now, what steps could you take towards rebuilding? Now, it might not be easy. It might be super hard. It might be super complicated. There's a lot of moving parts to this situation, perhaps. But what steps could you take towards rebuilding? That might be a good conversation to have with someone today. These are not easy chapters, and life's not easy. Because we have this tendency to mess things up. People around us have a tendency to mess things up. That's real life. We're thankful for the grace of God. We're thankful that He's given us these boundary lines that, if we stay within the boundary line that He's given us, we don't have to rebuild some of the stuff that we don't ruin because we follow the principles and guidelines and instructions that God's given us as a guardrail for our lives so we don't ruin stuff. Right? We're thankful for all of these things. But I'm also thankful for this story that just reminds us that when we do ruin stuff, take it seriously. Take this stuff seriously. Don't rationalize it. Don't minimize it. Take it seriously. And ask for help if you need help. And never stop having hope that God has the powerful ability and strength to rebuild from ruins.